Thanks for joining us here on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Malawi's opposition is claiming victory in the country's rerun of last year's presidential election. Judges rejected the first ballot won by the incumbent after evidence emerged of widespread rigging. The country's electoral commission has urged people to wait for the official results to be announced. And hopefully we'll be bringing you more on that story later on here on Focus on Africa. It's 1 month since the death of George Floyd, an unarmed black man choked to death by police in the U.S. And today, U.S. lawmakers are debating a bill to reform police tactics. The video footage of Mr. Floyd's last moments shocked the world and provoked protests, calling for an end to racism and recognize the hardships faced by black people and the inequalities left by the transatlantic slave trade. Last year, Ghana called on members of the African-American diaspora to return. The BBC's Thomas Nadi spoke to some who did.
Titus Busby and Tari Busby take a stroll at the Elmina Castle, one of the major colonial slave castles in the country. The twin African-American brothers were musicians in the U.S. but decided to relocate to Ghana in 2017 because of racial discrimination.
2016, 2017, me and brother, we were living in Alabama. It's a very racist part of the country. Our particular town, Florence, it was very racist. They made a lot of attempts to stop our businesses, a lot of attempts to, keep the hip-hop culture down. So, the violence came because, if you step up or stand up for yourself as a black man, that's when the violence comes. So, America is not a cool place. The whole country is racist. It's not just, this different spots, the whole thing. So, coming to Ghana is a very important thing for us. It was just, you don't have to worry about racism here.
They are now engaged in farming and entrepreneurship, but recent developments in America and the reaction across the world is not lost on them.
It's a long time coming. You cannot keep a people down for so long without them rising up. So I'm trying to figure out how America's going to deal with it, with the education and the internet. People are learning about their African ancestry, so they're not going to be satisfied with any second-class treatment at all.
The killing of George Floyd, the unarmed African-American, by a white police officer also provoked protests across the continent. In Ghana, attempts by security personnel to stop a Black Lives Matter vigil later turned chaotic after one of their leaders was arrested. A memorial was held for George Floyd at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center in the capital, Accra. The name of George Floyd is pasted on this wall, and that is how Ghana, the home of Pan-Africanism, has chosen to honor him. The wall will also be dedicated to other fallen African Americans who die under similar circumstances. This gesture is a reflection of the deep connection between Ghana and Africans in the diaspora. Over 150 of them living in this country have already been given Ghanaian citizenship, and over 1 million African Americans have visited the country since last year.
We have our arms wide open, ready to welcome you home. Please take advantage. Come home. Build a life in Ghana. You do not have to stay where you are not wanted forever. You have a choice, and Africa is waiting for you.
The Diaspora Africa Forum, which works together with the African Union, also provides support for African Americans willing to return home.
Change is coming. I really believe that what has happened with the George Floyd situation, the world will never be the same.
As Titus Busby and Tari Busby reflect on the future, their hope remains that the recent developments in the United States will be a turning point on the issue of racism. Thomas Nadi, BBC News, Ghana.
Let's delve a little deeper into this story. Now, joining me live is Abdul Latif Balanta from the African Diaspora Forum. He's in Baltimore. Thanks for talking to us, Abdul Latif. How are people marking the 1 month anniversary there in Baltimore?
Well, in Baltimore, the protests and the activity never really stopped. So we didn't commemorate today with anything special other than what we've been doing ever since he fell on May 25th. Basically, we had a very big gathering just the other day, Saturday. But just about every day in some Baltimore community, you'll find either a procession of vehicles rolling down the road with signs saying George Floyd's death was a travesty, or no justice, no peace, reparations for the nations. We in Baltimore seem like we are always on the front lines with regard to social justice, and so it hasn't stopped, and we haven't done anything special other than what we've been doing for quite some time
Abdul
now.
Latif, have these protests and processions made more African Americans want to move back to Africa?
Yes, you know, we believe that what's happening now is an awakening both in Africa as well as over here. When we see that there are protests in South Africa, for instance, when they protest on the Capitol, showing solidarity with George Floyd, we know that the African is awake to these issues and that they sympathize with us. Same thing as what we see in Ghana and in Nigeria. So it has made a difference. It has made us to understand that there's another place for us other than here, and that our brothers and sisters in Africa feel our pain.
Well, I mean, Ghana made the call for African Americans to return to what they call the motherland last year. So far, we know of at least 150 people who have moved back. Do you know of more people who are planning to move there in the near future?
Yes. I know of many, myself included, who's looking to try to reestablish myself there. I was one of those fortunate, and there was actually 216 of us that got dual citizenship last year. And the year before that, it was 30. Ghana has taken the lead with regard to opening up its arms to the diasporan community, and that there are more that are slated for this year as well. So there's a big buzz in the African American community that there's another home for us. And so the protest that we're having now on the streets, it has a different kind of connotation to it than what they did in the 60s, because in the 60s they were just fighting for their rights here and saying that we have to stay here and deal with it. Here we know now that there's an option for us, there's another home for us. And like one of the ministers said, their arms are open wide for us. And they've proven it with this dual citizenship and other opportunities. They're calling it a birthright.
I want to pick up on something you just mentioned, the fact that these protests are different from what we saw in the 60s and a fair bit in the 70s and 80s. The Black Lives Matter movement has certainly put racism on the map now, but for how long can this discussion be sustained?
Well, one of the things that Black Lives movements has done that distinguishes it from the movements in the 60s is that they haven't set themselves up with one identified leader who can be taken out, assassinated, and then the movement die out. Black Lives Movement makes itself takes pride in the fact that it is a grassroots movement. So in this respect, it is much more sustainable. And that's a part of what it is. I don't embrace or appreciate some of the consequences from it, but the movement points to the consequences in terms of the lootings and others as a consequence of the injustice. It is not a part of the platform for the Black Lives Movement's people, I understand.
All right. Now, we know that the U.S. Congress is debating police reforms today. 5 years ago, reforms were introduced in Baltimore. How have they changed the way black people are policed in that city?
Well, it required federal action. And when this administration has put the brakes on the necessity for it, it's still on the books with regard to the review, the community review forums and the other initiatives which weaves the community and the policing of itself. But because leadership on high with regard to the funding has pulled some of the funding with regard to it, there hadn't been a lot of action on those initiatives. It really hasn't.
Okay, Abdul Latif Balanta from the African Diaspora Forum, speaking to us there from Baltimore. I do appreciate your insight into this very important story. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Peter Okoche. Still to come on the program, tensions remain high as 3 countries still fail to agree on Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam.